I'm just an historian in a way, but I hope to show you that history can help us clarify some notions that we use without reflecting too much upon them. And the notion I'm mentioning is energy transition. What surprised me most probably is the use of history to talk about the future of energy. Very often in the public discourse, especially in the mouth of politicians, you can hear this idea that facing climate change, we have to do a new industrial revolution, as if there was anything similar to what we have to do now and what was the first industrial revolution. So many people have in their mind a false history of energy, as if the industrial revolution was any sort of energy transition. It's even, what is quite strange is you also have this false history in expertise. If you take the last IPCC Group 3 report, you have very strange sentences in the report, such as energy transitions can occur faster than in the past. Of course, as you all know in this room, the energy transitions of the past are somewhat mysterious. It's not very clear what they have in their mind. As you all know, I guess, we are burning more coal every year, more oil, and we're also burning more wood. Today, wood energy is the double of nuclear energy at the global level. So we are living with old sources of energy. If the colleagues from the IPCC Group 3 can write these strange sentences, it's because they have in mind this model. It's a model of technological substitution. You have a new technology and innovation replacing an old technology. It is a graph that you find, an image that you find in the last IPCC report. This model might work for the history of technology, but it certainly doesn't work for energies and materials. You cannot use a model of technological substitution to reflect on the dynamics of energy and materials. These are different dynamics, different histories. What I've told you about the energy which are just growing and growing is actually true for almost all raw materials. It's quite difficult to find examples of raw materials whose consumption at a global level has decreased. One example is sheep wool, which has decreased by a third since the 1990s because of the diffusion of synthetic fibers, which is not necessarily good news for the environment. We have only two examples which are kind of relevant to our contemporary challenge. It is asbestos and mercury, where we have seen sudden decrease. So change is possible, but we have to act in a different way. It's not that asbestos or mercury have become obsolete. No, it's because they were prohibited, right? So the hope of making oil, gas, and coal obsolete in 2 or 3 decades to stop global warming at 2 degrees Celsius is based, it's not based on history. It's a radical thing. It's an extraordinarily strange thing. And the hope that new technologies can make obsolete old energy is not based on a serious understanding of the history of energy. If the experts of IPCC Group 3 talked about past energy transitions, it is also because it is true that historians have talked about transitions in the past. And in a way, energy transition has been the fetish of the historiography of energy. If you take major books in the history of energy, their main topic is precisely energy transitions. Even Václav Smil, who is probably one of the best energy historians that we can read, the main narrative of his book is energy transitions. And you can easily see that actually in the table of contents. The first chapter will be talking about wood, hydraulic power, animal energy. The chapter about the 19th century will be mainly about coal and the steam engine, and the chapter on the 20th century will be about oil. But of course, as you might know in this room, 95% of coal was actually extracted after 1900. So coal is really important in the 20th century, not in the 19th century. And the great age of coal is today, when we are probably reaching the peak coal, right? So the history of energy is a history of accumulation, not a history of transition. And it is quite a basic point. Probably more subtle point is that the history of energy is also a history of symbiosis. What I mean by that is we really need to stop thinking about energy as being in competition. Energy and materials work together. The classic narrative of an energy transition taking place during the Industrial Revolution obliterates two crucial points. First, the burning of wood increased in the 19th century, even in rich countries. And it also increased in the 20th century, by the way. But it is also that coal is completely dependent on wood. Britain in the 20th century used more wood just to support the coal mines, than Britain had burned during the 18th century. Right? And since it was construction timber, actually Britain required 6 or 7 times more forest acreage, area, surface, to produce its energy in the 20th century than it had needed during the 18th century. Right? So wood and coal are not in competition, they are in symbiosis. And this dynamic, you can find it today. Right? I guess you know what I'm talking about. Hywind Tampen, the famous floating wind power in the North Sea. I mean, the interesting thing about Hywind Tampen, it's really a technological progress, of course, but it is also that it powers the extraction of oil and gas, right? And it is a very common thing. Actually, it's not only Norway which is extracting fossil fuels with clean electricity. More and more green electrons, in a way, are being used to extract fossil fuels. And let's take also this example, which shows you the radical strangeness of this idea of energy transition. It's a famous power plant located in Britain, Drax power plants. Each year, it burns at least 4 times more wood than Britain burned in the 18th century to produce electricity. And this electricity represents between 1% and 2% of British energy. Right? So there are 2 conclusions to be made about this from this power plant. First, the kind of impossibility of having the same use that we had with fossil fuels with biomass. There is simply not enough biomass to replace the energy and materials produced by fossil fuels. And second, the fact that, you know, after 2 centuries of energy transitions, Britain is burning at least 4, 5, 6 times more wood than it did before doing all these energy transitions. So once you take into account this symbiotic and cumulative dimension of energy dynamics, how come the idea of energy transition became so natural? That it became really the commonplace. Like, it seems natural to talk about energy transition in the past, in the future, and today. The first thing to notice that it is quite a recent notion. For most of the 20th century, experts never talked about energy transition. And what I've just told you, of course, everybody knew it, right? And they rather imagined the future of energy as an expanded present, not as a radically different present. You can see that on this graph, which is a futurology proposed by a promoter of solar energy in the US in the 1970s. Solar energy will grow, but also nuclear energy will grow, coal energy will grow, everything will grow. And there is a small group of scientists who are going to introduce the idea of energy transition. They are atomic scientists, US atomic scientists who had been through the Manhattan Project and were convinced that the breeder reactor, the nuclear breeder reactor, not the classical traditional fission reactor, the breeder reactor, is a kind of eschatological technology. It's about end of times. And for them, there will be an energy transition for the very simple reason that we will run out of fossil fuels. And so by force, there will be an energy transition out of fossil fuels. But if you look at the lower graph of this slide, you will see that the end of the energy transition, according to them, will be in a very far-away future. It's midway between now and 1,000 years. So it leaves us lots of time, right? And the energy transition will be geared by the rising cost of the extraction of coal, which will make that nuclear power will be competitive necessarily, right? So what is the scientific scandal that you were mentioning? It is that we have used this vision of energy dynamics to reflect on the climate crisis. Because today we have to do the energy transition not in 3 or 4 centuries, but in 3 or 4 decades. We have to do it globally. It has to include food in a very strange way. And we also don't have the price incentive, or it's not such a strong incentive, right? So how this scientific scandal took place, I think it started in the 1970s, during the decade of the energy crisis. Energy crisis became really a dominant frame to reflect on energy in the 1970s, and energy transition became a kind of very vague word to describe the solution for the energy crisis. The first person to use the word energy transition in the media is an American president, Jimmy Carter, who made a very important speech on the 18th of April 1977, where he said that in the past, the US had done 2 energy transitions, one from wood to coal, the second from coal to oil, and now, facing the oil shocks, the US needed to do a 3rd energy transition. So, interestingly enough, for an historian, when the energy transition really started to emerge in the public sphere, it was based on this radically false history, right? And Jimmy Carter was talking about this graph when he was making this false history, where you can see the 2 beautiful transitions. Of course, the trick is to put everything in shares. So that's really an important point for actually the historiography. Historians have talked about energy transition because they have used this vision of the evolution of energy mix in shares, not in absolute values. But of course, what matters for the climate crisis are absolute values, not shares. This graph, which is really an original way of presenting energy dynamics, was stolen from the work of a forgotten but very important character in the history of energy expertise, and this is Cesare Malchetti. Cesare Malchetti, who recently passed away, was an Italian scientist, a staunch promoter of nuclear energy. For him, the future energy would be nuclear plus hydrogen, and he was actually the founding father of the idea of a hydrogen economy. From the 1960s onward, he's talking about the hydrogen economy, because he knew that for nuclear energy to really replace fossil fuels, you needed to escape the small market of electricity production and replace oil and gas. So his vision of the future was putting enormous nuclear power plants in the middle of the oceans to create hydrogen, and this hydrogen will be then distributed throughout the world with boats. So he had this kind of Dr. Strangelove persona in a way, but he was also an historian, or an amateur historian. And he started to collect quantitative data on the evolution of the global energy mix to reflect upon the time that this utopia of an economy, a world economy powered with atomic energy and hydrogen, how long will it take? That's really the question he asked himself using history. And he started to make these fantastic graphs, which have had, I think, enormous influence on the way we have thought upon the dynamics of energy. And as you can see, according to him, there was the wave of coal, then the wave of oil, and there is the coming energy wave of natural gas. On that point, actually, he was quite right. Where he was wrong, it is that, according to him, coal should have more or less disappeared by 2020. And on the contrary, actually, coal is still extremely important. So he has been criticized by many people, especially by Václav Smil, for making this mistake. But this is quite unfair, because Cesare Malchetti was actually was one of the most pessimistic forecaster of his times. He was reacting to what was being done at IASA, which is a very important institute near Vienna for energy modeling, where they started to use computers to imagine the future of the energy system. And when you use computer, of course, everything becomes easy. The IASA was asked to find smooth transition paths out of fossil fuels in 50 years. In a way, it was they were asked to refute the Club of Rome report. The JASA was headed by a German scientist called Wolfgang Haffele, who was a big promoter of the breeder reactor. And they started making energy modeling, MEDE, MESSAGE, and these models are still used today for the net zero scenarios that are studied by the IPCC. And according to them, there were many scenarios that could help us to get out of fossil fuels by 50 years, sorry. And Cesare Marchetti, with these graphs and these studies, wanted to show that there was, on the contrary, a strong inertia, right? That it would take much more time to get out of fossil fuels. So the sad conclusion of this little story, it is that the most pessimistic person on our capacity to get out of fossil fuels in the 21st century was actually far too optimistic on the capacity of humanity to get out of coal. The idea of energy transition became acceptable in expertise at that moment, in the mid-1970s. And it was really the right moment for the oil industry. Because at that time, climate change started to emerge as a problem in the US, as a political problem. And at that time, Exxon was not climato-skeptics. They were doing actually very good research on climate change. They were financing Jim Hanson's research, for instance. But they were transitionists. And in 1982, the head of Exxon R&D made a fantastic discourse to climatologists, explaining that, of course, there is climate change. Of course, there is the greenhouse effect. This is all physics, not very interesting, right? We knew that from a long time ago. The key question, according to him, is whether the energy transition will happen before or after the climate catastrophe. So it was really a question of schedule. And actually, many climatologists and experts framed the question in this way. He's not the only one framing the question in this way, but he knew this was rubbish. And because in like 3 months after this speech, he was in China explaining that coal would be a very important and a major energy source of the beginning of the 21st century. So he knew that this idea of an energy transition taking place before the climate change becoming serious was an illusion. Energy transition was also fundamental for the beginning of climate economics. If energy transition has become central in climate economics, it is because the same people were the experts on the energy crisis. Energy economists of the 1970s became the experts of climate economics. And they used the same vocabulary, the same theories. The best example of that is William Nordhaus, Nobel Prize in Economics in 2018. In 1973, he wrote a very important paper on the allocation of energy resources. The question he asked is, oil is becoming more expensive in 1973. The price quadrupled in a few weeks. Does it mean that we have to conserve oil? On the contrary, we have to extract oil right now, while it is very valuable. Why? Because in a few decades, we will have the breeder reactor, which will make oil obsolete. So it would be such a pity not to use oil right now when it is very useful. And he called the breeder reactor the backstop technology. Like, this notion of backstop technology will play a very important role in climate economics later. 2 years later, he's at JASA, working with Cesare Marchetti, and he writes the very first paper from an economist on climate change, and he makes the same reasoning. There is an issue with global warming. Does it mean that we have to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels right now? Not necessarily. It is better to wait, because it will be so much easier to do the energy transition in 2 or 3 decades when we will have the breeder reactor, right? So it's really the same argument, one on the energy crisis and the other on climate change. And energy transition also played a very important role at the beginning of the IPCC, and especially the IPCC Group 3. Nowadays, the IPCC, of course, plays a key role has played a key role in the global scientific consensus on global warming, right? But when it was created, its objective was quite different. It was to buy time, to slow down the alarm. In 1985, a group of climatologists was created by the UNEP and the World Meteorological Organization, which made a very clear report saying that we need to cut fossil fuel emission by 25% before 2000. In 1988, there is a global conference on climate change in Toronto, in Canada, and the conclusion of the conference is the same. We need to cut CO2 emissions by 25% by 2005. They both 5 years. When the US government heard about all these issues, they thought it was rubbish, that it is intolerable to imagine that a bunch of climatologists, technocrats from the UNEP would dictate energy policy of the US government. So they wanted to create a new group of experts, which would be intergovernmental, not international, intergovernmental. So the key point is that they are nominated by governments. And when you look at the archives of the diplomatic correspondence between the US government and their representative at the World Meteorological Organization, I mean, the stakes are very clear. We want the IPCC to reflect the interest of the US government. And we want the governments to nominate experts, not only from the environmental ministry or the people interested in climate. We want people nominated by the Ministry of Energy, the Ministries of Agriculture, and by energy companies. So they want serious people who internalize the difficulty of doing an energy transition in a way. The chair of IPCC Group 3 at that time was Marit Reigstad, who is chair of IPCC Group 3, also is the chief of the delegation of the US to the Rio conference in 1992, and is also openly climato-skeptics. It might seem strange that the chair of IPCC Group is climato-skeptics, but at that time, the chair of IPCC Group 2 was also climato-skeptics. He's a Russian meteorologist called Yuri Israel. And Marit Reigstad, before the Rio conference of '92, took his order from John Sununu, who was the chief of staff of George Bush. And John Sununu gave a very clear roadmap. First of all, in Rio, do not commit to any target. Second, do not promise any money. So no money, no target, play the technology card. And playing the technology card is precisely what expertise on mitigation has been doing for the last 30 years. I'm not sure it is readable, but basically this is a kind of quantitative analysis of the 6 IPCC reports of the Group 3 from '92 to the last one, 2022. Most of the discussions are about supply side, about technological change. At the beginning, the important technology, it was nuclear. Then it became renewables, and then it became carbon capture and storage, the major technological topics. And the story of carbon capture and storage is very interesting to understand what has happened in climate mitigation expertise. At the beginning, carbon capture and storage was considered as a crazy idea. It was put forward by the fossil fuel interests. The obvious motive was to explain that they could keep their assets running and they would just implement depollution technologies, right? In the 2001 report from the IPCC Group 3, they say that producing electricity with coal, with carbon capture and storage, make coal electricity more expensive than nuclear. So what is the point, right? And then the governments, probably the governments of Norway, but also Canada and the US for sure, ordered a report to the IPCC Group 3 on carbon capture and storage, which really changed the status of this technology. What was seen as a clearly dubious technology promoted by clear industrial interest became a green technology, a potentially green technology. Carbon capture and storage was presented as not that expensive, And they also explain in this report that we could store 2,000 gigatons of liquefied CO2 on the ocean's floor, in the soil, in the grounds, right? So an enormous quantity, a crazy quantity of CO2. The next step was the introduction of negative emissions. Negative emissions, the idea is, it's invented, I could say, in Sweden, in the paper industry. They connect biomass energy, because of course the paper industry is a big producer of biomass energy. They use wood to power their industry. They connect the paper industry with CCS. And then suddenly you can have negative emissions, since the tree that you burn capture CO2 when it grows. Then you burn the tree to produce electricity, but you capture the CO2 outside of the power plant and then you pump it in the ground. Integrated assessment models love this BECCS because it makes mitigation cheaper. And the result of that is that in the 2014 IPCC Group 3 report, BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, became the biggest carbon sink in the world. 10 gigatons of CO2 per year could be absorbed with this technology. By the way, the global production of food today is 4 billion cubic meters, so probably, I don't know, 1.5 or perhaps 2 billion tons of carbon. So there's clearly a question of quantity, and it doesn't add up. Anyway, why it is important? Because next year, in 2015, there was the Paris Agreement. And in a way, the Paris Agreement was made possible thanks to this kind of empty technological promises, right? It was the idea that we could reach carbon neutrality by 2050 thanks to this kind of technologies, which do not exist and will probably never exist. So to summarize, I would say that it is no surprise that if you're looking, it's quite difficult actually to look at this graph, but if you're looking at the forecast of the International Energy Agency, they do not see any energy transition coming. They can see, of course, the development of renewables, the green line that is increasing significantly, and a decrease of coal, because coal electricity is being replaced by renewables, that is true. But for oil and gas, it remains at very high level, right? So there is no energy transition coming. And it should not surprise any historian of energy, because energy transition is a very, very strange notion indeed. It's not based on an empirical understanding of the dynamics of energy. And to just really summarize the argument, my book shows that energy transition projects a false history, a history that does not exist, on a future which remains completely elusive. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jean-Baptiste. Luckily for us, you're coming back later on so that we can discuss further with you, because I guess we are quite a lot of people who have questions for you. But we're going to move on for the next presentation. We do not have an energy crisis, but a crisis of extraction. This is a translated by me quote from the Norwegian book The Energy Revolution, written by our next speaker, Bjørn Samset. Bjørn Halvard, he is a physicist and a climate scientist, and he works as well as head of research at the CICERO Center for International Climate Research here in Oslo. He was also a coordinating lead author for the physical science basis in the 6th report from the IPCC, published in 2021, and also a member of the Academy's Committee on Climate, Energy and Biodiversity. Now, with his recent book, Bjørn wishes to give the readers the basic knowledge they need to discuss with confidence the energy trilemma between affordability, accessibility, and sustainability. Now, I wonder which one of these pillars does he think is more important, and how do we make the right choices moving forward? Bjørn Samset is ready to share his reflections with us now, so please give him as well a warm welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Jean-Baptiste, for an excellent talk. Slightly depressing, at least for those of us who kind of keep trying to argue that we really need to do something, right? I don't think anyone here disagrees with that. The question is, what? So I will apologize to you that I have kept my slides in Norwegian, but I will, of course, speak in English, and I will make the exercise of trying to translate as we go. I will claim that we are in the middle of a transition. Not necessarily an energy transition, the way Jean-Baptiste has described it, but certainly a transition where choices that are being made today, either by us or by industry or by someone out there, will have ramifications for the next decades, maybe centuries, just like they did in the past. And if we don't participate in that discussion, someone else is going to make those choices. So how do we make this transition? Well, first of all, we need to understand it. And then, if I have time at the end, since this is an academic institution and there are many academics in the hall, I'm going to try and frame my views on what role us as academics should take. That's a dangerous word for an academic, should take in at least the Norwegian debate. But first, we have been listening for a half hour now. I'm going to, being a scientist, I'm going to make a scientific experiment. I have done for this similar talks like this in various audiences. So I'm going to show you a couple of slides. Our mindset now is the future of energy. Right? So what do we do? And I'm going to need you to make choices. I want either this or this. And just since there are so many academics in the hall, this is not an option. This is not an option. This or this. All right? We are a Norwegian audience, so let us start with this. Yeah, some thinking. Okay. The hive mind ended up quite positively, but not uniformly positively. That's fine. It's surprising how much more positive audiences that listen to talks about energy seem to be about this picture than the Norwegian debate in general. Granted, noted. What about this one? For those of you who don't recognize it, that is a nuclear power plant. Ooh, that's closer to 50-50. That's interesting. All right. Of course, I'm giving you no context now, right? This is, we can discuss that later. And then finally, this one. Okay, well, interesting. So I think we had the most thumbs up for wind power. We had a 50-50 on nuclear, and we had a clear thumbs down on the nice Norwegian offshore infrastructure that we've built for such a long time, and that has built our national treasure, if you will. So we can get back to this. I'm not aiming to give you any answers on which of these we should have, but the thing is that whatever we choose, whatever combination of these, right? I mean, you can see this one kind of represents fossil fuels. The first one kind of represents renewables. The one in the middle is kind of the physicists' favorite technology, which is something else completely. They all involve loads more choices than just where we get our energy from and who makes money from it. It's much wider than that. And that is why I'm calling it an energy revolution. Not because I'm thinking we're just going to revolutionize our energy supply, but because the way we use energy, if we change that, if there is a transition, that will also revolutionize most of society. I'm going to have a historical aside, which is dangerous when I'm speaking in front of a historian. So I'm a physicist. But this one, right, it's our classical energy history. When did we last have what we can call an energy revolution? We've had some through history, right? The invention, if you will, of life, of photosynthesis. That was definitely a revolution for how the planet evolved. When we started to use fire was one. If you look here, that is really where it takes off, obviously. So you can deduce from this that the availability of loads of stored energy in the ground was really the spark that ignited the great acceleration or the great expansion of society and our great welfare. Could be, but then why didn't it go differently? Could it have gone differently? What if we did? What if by an accident of geology we didn't have these vast stores? That's also been discussed by some historians, and it's interesting to look back and see what did we actually have at the time. Well, I mean, this is New York at around about 1900. And it's 1902, I think, and there's a relatively famous picture from the same thing. That is a picture from 1902 of solar cells on a New York rooftop. And as far as I can tell, that is not AI or anything that is vetted. That is actual history. We, of course, also had wind power. We had wind, we had solar, we had hydro, we had all these things. Of course, we didn't have the capacity to expand them, to build them in such vast quantities as what we've done with extraction of fossil fuels. But it was there. And we humans are nothing if not ingenious in the way and inventive and laborious. Right? When we set ourselves to do something, we generally do it. So how would that history have gone? That's an alternative counterfactual history. Nobody knows. You can speculate. But that's not what happened, right? What happened was coal, oil, and gas not transitioning into each other, but building on top of each other. That's very clear from the energy graph, and that built into that. And if you look closely at that picture, it's hard to imagine an urban sprawl, a modern urban sprawl, without all these various kinds of energy, right? Coal, which you need for the power, that's one thing, but you also need it to make the steel that is in all these buildings, the oil, which you need for all the cars, which you need for all the ships that have brought all these materials here, the gas, which fuels the stoves, and maybe not this city, but in many cities that gave you the power, et cetera, et cetera. We have built society around the precise properties of these three sources of energy. It has defined how we built modern society. It's not the only way. We could have built something else, but we built this thing. So if we are to transition, if we are to do something else, then that will also affect, obviously, how society is put together. I don't think this surprises anyone, but it isn't there present at the front of the debate as much as just how much money can we make from an alternative energy source. So I said up there in bold, now we're doing it again. If you look closely, there is actually a lot happening. There is a growth. It's the start of something. It's not a transition, but it is a growth of new energy forms, all of them delivering electricity, which is what we have been getting from, at least from coal and natural gas as well. But it's a different way of running society. It's much more it is electrified. It is a different way of putting together society, and the more power we get that is direct electric, that is differently distributed, that is part of a different economic system, etc., well, the more options we have for building society in a different way. So options are opened, whether these replace all coal, oil, and gas or not. So in however you frame it, there will be some kind of a change, potentially a revolution. How can the future look? That is the question here. How can we screw this thing together, if you think in IKEA mode, right? We have all these components. How can we put them together? Well, to answer that, we also have to answer what demands do we have of the energy sector? What does this revolution have to deliver? I'm a climate scientist, so I'm going to bring in the climate here, because I don't think we take that seriously enough either. Many people take it very, very seriously. We are not taking it seriously enough. So the consequences of climate change are becoming ever more visible. Luckily, this is not, I don't think even Donald Trump doesn't believe in it anymore. I don't believe in him when he says what he says. World Weather Attribution is an example of an academic institute or grouping that have made a whole career, there are multiple careers, out of pointing out that all the extreme weather that we're seeing today is made more frequent, more impactful, and more damaging by global warming. Shouldn't really surprise anyone. We've known this for about 100 years now, that it would become like that, but now we're seeing it. We're seeing it every year, every month, almost every week, and is really causing enormous damages. So of course, an energy transition or an energy change that keeps this to a minimum is also economically favorable. But then on the longer term, we really have the choice between two extremes of worlds. I just picked food production as one of the multiple examples that you could pull. In a low emission scenario, which means low usage of coal, oil, and gas into the future, which means low warming, well, we still have certain areas of current very, very productive arable land that fall outside, or fall in uncertain range or outside of the safe climatic space for producing food. I.e., we will need a fourth agricultural revolution just to keep up our present level. In a high warming case, you see a lot of red areas here, which essentially means that the world food supply will collapse. And that's just one of any number of these very, very grim, dire warnings if we stick to the upper path. Of course, we shouldn't stick to the upper path. But if there is no energy transition, if there is no reduction, if there is no CCS, if that's a pipe dream, then that is exactly what will happen. We will end up in the upper range of warming. Global food supply will collapse, and all the doomsday sayers of the climate activism currently will be right, because a lot of the civilized world will collapse. So we have to make a change, some kind of a change. This is my most complex graph for today, but I brought it because it's also very new, and because it is being discussed at the highest levels, including by Donald Trump. This is the current version of the future scenarios that will be used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, only recently published. So what this is a set of emission scenarios, so future scenarios for CO2 emissions from fossil fuel usage and a couple of other things, and then the associated global mean temperature change. So this world where global food supply collapses, that's up here somewhere. And the Paris Agreement currently, or with the Glasgow Amendment, sits around about here. And so there's only one type of emission scenario that leads to a global warming that is, shall we say, what we current policymakers would call acceptable, or according to the Paris Agreement. Now, if you look at the colors, the purple, the green ones, they're here, right? They are the ones where emissions drop, fade away, almost totally go away within a couple of decades, as Jean-Baptiste said. Those are the energy transition scenarios, where really the integrated assessment models that have made this have really envisaged a complete energy transition. Renewable energy forcing out coal, oil, and gas. That is the only way, just by straight physics, that is the only way we can stay within any of the current climate targets. If we can't do that, if we do not displace coal, oil, and gas within a few decades, then we end up with a global warming that will cause so much damages, certainly in vulnerable regions. If we go back, you see the vulnerability, it's here. I am now circling more than 1 billion people. A bit less, but still a high population in sub-Saharan Africa, etc. Right? There will be kinds of collapse that we really do not want to consider. And that is quite a strong incentive to actually, for once, have an energy transition. So the question is, faced with this kind of a spectrum, this kind of a ghost, this kind of a monster, can we have an energy transition? Because this pressure wasn't there before. Is that enough to change the course of history? Well, we know what we can do, right? These are our building blocks. They're all there. There is no viable option for the future of energy that is not on this one slide. There's coal, oil, gas, solar, wind, hydro, biofuels, nuclear, geothermal. And I'm sure there are people in the room who say, well, what about this and this source? We can discuss it later. I would claim they're all on here. Of course, there are other smaller options. I didn't put fusion on there because I really don't believe fusion will be there in any reasonable amount of time. We know these ones. My point is that we have to stack these cards in some way such that they deliver us the energy that we need. But come back to the original argument, the argument I started with. It's not just about how we produce the energy. It's about all these other things as well that go with it. So if we want electricity in one form or another, we're going to have loads of storage. Doesn't have to be batteries. You can use heat storage. You can use pumped hydro. There are very many ways of storing energy, but we need to store energy one way or another, or multiple ways probably. We need to transport energy from one place to another. There's this fantastic argument that comes every now and then, is that, well, you can just put solar power or solar cells on 20% of the Sahara, and you've covered global energy needs. Yes, numerically that is true. In practice, nah, not going to work. For instance, for these two reasons. There is the fact that we have to extract resources, both for the energy production itself, for all these things. There's a limited amount of resources. There's a limited amount of nature from which to extract these resources. We do need that nature for other things as well. There are fundamental limits to living on a globe. That's 149 million square kilometers to go on, of land to go on. There's all our usage of plastic. There is all usage of fossil fuels, fossil fuel products in medicine production, for instance. There is the fact that coal powers steel production. There is the question of energy security and all the, well, we hardly need to point that one out now. You saw what happened when the Strait of Hormuz closed, right? And how uncertain the whole world becomes just from this one choke point. There is the fact that with great amounts of energy comes great power. There are a few things that drive power more on the global scene than energy. And then, in the small picture on top here, is nature conservation. The IPBES, the sister panel of the IPCC, kind of tells us that we have no more nature to give. We need to conserve nature. We need to put nature back into its original state if we want the biological systems to function. That is very incompatible with this entire industrial transition or societal revolution. So it's not just a question of getting enough energy. Right? It is a question of stacking all these cards in a reasonable way. And then finally, because it needed a slide of its own, the best way to do this, of course, is simply to use less energy. The best energy is the one you haven't used. But that's not so sexy, right? That's not techno-optimistic. It really can be. You can make more efficient technology, but you generally don't win elections by telling people to turn off their lights when they leave the room, even though that's what every sensible person should be doing. I'm going to show you how this looks, but just at this point, I'm thinking maybe, I'm getting a little philosophical here, but maybe the revolution is how we think about energy. Because I have a feeling when I'm talking to, in particular, people in the energy industry and to politicians, that they consider energy like money. It's something to extract as much as you can. When you have it, you invest it, you use it to the best of your ability. You can maybe bank some of it. It's a resource. It's something to fight over, right? It makes the world go round. Just like money makes the economy and the world go round, energy makes the world go round. So it's really kind of the natural form of energy is the natural form of money. Maybe we rather need to think that energy is like food. It is something that we absolutely need. It's something you could, in principle, consider a basic human right. It is something that there is a limit to how much we can produce. We can produce it more efficiently, but we cannot produce it infinitely. If we don't, we produce it. If we don't eat it, it goes bad. It's the same thing with energy. You cannot store it indefinitely. It's all these things. And we think about food differently to money. I think we need to think more in the latter term. But okay, let's see how these things can look. Let's go back to numbers. This is the same version of the graph. It's just the one I happened to use in the previous book, so it has slightly different colors. The point of using that is that I'm going to show an example of how this can look towards towards 2100 in a scenario where we actually do transition in some way, where we achieve our climate goals, so where global warming does not go above 2 degrees. This is just one example. It comes from an integrated assessment model. It is one of the key scenarios used in the 6th IPCC assessment report by all working groups, my own working group 1 and also working group 3. It's one of the example scenarios called SSP 126. What happens? So there are 3 things that happen. First of all, of course, there is this radical reduction in the use of fossil fuels. That is not just a feature of this scenario. That is the feature of all the scenarios where we stay within the climate targets. It is not a feature of scenarios where we don't adhere to the climate targets. Then, of course, we just keep on. The integrated assessment models, they know coal, oil, and gas are cheap, so they will keep on using them. But if you force a climate target, then the integrated assessment models, which only know money, they only know economy, they give you this. They give this drastic reduction, but they're not gone by 2100. They're down to 1/3 or something, and we still make the climate targets because we can have some residual emissions. There is this extreme growth in renewables, usually about 2/3 solar, 1/3 wind, in some combo or another. That is also a feature of most of the scenarios. And then there is something else, and that differs, what this 3rd component is. In this particular one, it is an extreme growth in biofuels. How on earth will we be able to grow that amount of plants for biofuels? Nobody knows. That integrated assessment model has no concept. It only knows economy. Right? You need something the size of all of Brazil or all of India or something to grow that. That area does not exist. But this is one of the main scenarios that was used by the IPCC. They did not check this realism at all. And that is because all these scenarios have something more or less unrealistic like that. There are no really kind of well-functioning energy transition scenarios, even in the IPCC, even if Working Group 3, as was pointed out, say that it's possible. People generally ask, what about nuclear power? That's the purple one, but there are other scenarios where nuclear power grows, though never to more than about 20% of the total. That seems to be, at least according to the analytics, the technological max. So okay, that's one option. We can discuss very many other options. The point is that if we are to avoid this collapse of the food system, for instance, we need something like this. Okay, other questions? Do we have the materials we need? Do we have the space? Can nature take this? When we are doing this, maybe we should also take the opportunity to build an energy system that can right some of the wrongs of the past. This is current energy use per person, or it was in 2024. We can see this very clear pattern that surprises no one. This is climate risk at 2 degrees. An interestingly inverse pattern. This is where climate change hits the hardest. Why? Well, partly because climate risk is partly the physical change, so it's partly extreme weather and all that. It is also vulnerability and exposure. So exposure is because there are quite many people in this area of the world, but the vulnerability is partly because there is no energy to use for adaptation. So these things are connected. Of course, solar and wind are more, say, equally distributed than coal, oil, and gas. So there is power in this. So, final point. How do we solve the energy trilemma? Well, I would claim the first part of the energy trilemma, the energy security, that is well in hand. That is well in hand by the debate that says, we need power. Vi må ha strøm. Of course, everyone wants power. You can't have power cuts. People are arguing for that already. Second part of the trilemma, well, it's not just we want power, we want cheap power. That is also very well in hand. People are yelling for cheap power every day. These two debates don't need our help. The last one, this is where it gets complex. We want cheap power now and also in the future extracted from a nature that we can live in. That's a lot harder to to say. That's a lot harder to argue. That debate is what needs our help. And if we don't put that as the foundation, the other two become pointless. So that is, I would say, our job as academics in the energy debate, apart from having whatever personal views we have, which we can, of course, have. Our role, I would say, is to be the front figures for a knowledge-based and calm discussion forum. There's quite a lot of shouting in the energy debate these days. There will always be shouting in the debate. But sometimes someone has to come with the calm arguments. I think we can do that. I think we should have a zero tolerance for the simple solutions. There's quite a few deliverers of very simple solutions out there today. Simple solutions will not fly. And we know that because of all the complexity that we've just sat here and listened to for a whole hour. And then I think we need to be the standard bearers of sustainability. For some discussion of sustainability that we can happily discuss, but this is the part where no one else really picks up the banner. We need to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. So please have a seat. Highly interesting and thought-provoking. And the audience, I'm sure that you have a lot of questions, but I thought maybe I should start. Once again, thank you so much, both of you. And I've been noting quite a lot during your talks. And now that you've listened to each other, I would like for the two of you to start sort of talking together, or at least commenting on each other. And I would like to hear from you, Bjørn. You started off by saying thank you for an excellent presentation, but slightly depressing. That was your conclusion in the beginning, because you have a lot of similarities. You both talk about the complexity of the intertwined and entangled of the different energy sources. But Bjørn, what do you think is dividing the two stories that you're giving us? And why do you see his notion as slightly depressing?
It may be because I kind of agree with your view of history, that it shows us that this is really, really difficult. And still, since my starting point is way too deep knowledge of what can actually happen if climate change really runs amok, that is something I really, really think we should avoid. So I would love for there to be some kind of a historical analog that we can latch onto. But we've only seen one history, right? Obviously, there's only been one realization, and it could have gone in very many different ways. So maybe one thing I would be interested in challenging you on is how much would have had to gone differently for this to look more positive, right? Is there a way? And then also maybe also a related question. We haven't really had an incentive to transition away from, say, coal, really until now, I would say. Right? You can always say that some scientists have warned that there would be a problem. Say when we managed to stop acid rain, we could see the dead trees. For the ozone layer, people's skin didn't really start burning. But it was kind of visible enough, and it was easy enough to change. But for coal, in particular, there really has not been an incentive until we get hit by extreme weather. So can that help, you think?
I mean, I will start with the first question. Basically, the counterfactual. That's what you were pointing at, which is a method which is more and more used by economic historians. Actually, there are papers on that, and for the case of Britain, which is the most studied case, basically after 1860, it is materially impossible to imagine the same kind of development that Britain had without coal. And I just want to remind you that Britain in 1860 was extraordinarily poor compared to our living standards. Right? In 1860, Britain, I think there was around 50,000 steam engines. 50,000, this is nothing. We have, I mean, in Great Britain now, there are like 40 million cars. So it's a radically completely different world with almost no mechanical power. Right? So then you showed a beautiful picture of New York 1900s. It is true that coal consumption globally in 1900s was very small compared to our consumption, but it was not the case for New York. New York was already a massive consumer of coal, and actually all the bricks that were shown on the picture, they were made out of coal. And the brick industry in 1900 was the third industrial consumer of coal in the US. Right? So New York was already a coal city in 1900. Could we have imagined a much bigger development of an electric civilization in a way? That was the dream of many people in 1900s. It is true that there were much less incentive to get out of coal in 1900s, but if you read the thoughts and of many different actors in 1900s, they are convinced that electricity will destroy coal. And there was this hope that there would be a shift from an electrical civilization. Because coal, even if climate change was not invoked, always seemed problematic. First, the working conditions are absolutely awful. And we're talking about, in Britain in 1900s, 1 million people buried under the ground. I mean, it's very, very direct consequences of coal extraction.
We still see that today, though. I mean, there was an accident just a couple of weeks ago in China.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, actually, the number of coal miners started to decrease only in 2015 in the world, right? Because there were so many coal miners in Asia. And coal was also very polluting. Just think about all the smogs that took place at the beginning of the 20th century. So, I mean, coal was always thought as very problematic. And the dream was electricity will just clean up the world. If you read, like Lewis Mumford, who is a famous historian of technology, is convinced that hydropower will just clean up the world. It was not solar power at the time, but hydropower. But that didn't happen, right? I mean, we knew how to produce electricity for a long time without using fossil fuel, but we didn't use it so much, or it was not enough, right? So the counterfactual that, because they were like perhaps, I mean, the solar panels, of course, they're just producing heat, I mean, the one that you show, could have really led us to a different path with the same kind of wealth without the fossil fuels. It just doesn't work at all. I mean, it's really an illusion. So it is true that history is quite depressing. When we started to be really aware of climate change, I would say the 1970s, the debate was, it's going to be major in China. I mean, coal is going to expand in China. And that's why in 1979, it was quite clear in the US academia that climate change would happen. So we would have to adapt. And adaptation was the key topic. And I think it is really what politicians talked about. It is adaptation. Transition always seemed very strange, but adaptation was something very serious. And they said that it was inevitable because of the forthcoming expansion of coal in Asia. And I'm not sure China had so many possibilities to electrify a 1 billion population using something else than coal in 1979, when China started to open up. Nuclear power was far too expensive. The first nuclear plants, which were built in the 1990s, they even imported the cement of the nuclear plants, just to tell you the complete dependence at that time. So, I mean, yeah, I think counterfactual will not help us. That we won't go very far with counterfactual on this topic. Sorry, this was a very long answer. I apologize.
No, that's what we want. That's what we're here for. You said towards the end of your talk, Jean-Baptiste, there is no energy transition coming. You started your presentation with, we are in the middle of, the largest transition that we've seen since the Industrial Revolution, basically. Who of you is right?
No, we don't use transition in the same way, I think.
I think that's fair. So it's not necessarily an energy transition in that I also don't believe we'll see a rapid displacement of fossil fuels. However, I tend to believe some of the optimism that I see in the renewable energy sector, right? This is a sector where there is growth, there is opportunity, there are all these young, clever people coming in wanting to make make an impression. They're getting more economic incentives. They're making money. There's the extra pressure from AI, from the AI industry, which is currently a very successful. I mean, you can discuss whether you like it or not, but it is driving a demand. It will come on top, right? It will be more and more. But that means that the renewable energy industry will grow. It will grow by a lot, and that drives technology. It drives the S curve of technology, so it will become cheaper. We will get better ways of storing energy. So all these questions that we've had for a while, we need to solve them. We will. And then the question becomes, well, what happens at the end of lifetime of current power plants? They will need to be replaced with something. Is it a given that they will be replaced by more coal, oil, and gas, or can they actually be replaced by a disruptive technology? Because disruptive technologies have happened, even though they haven't happened in the energy field, because we've had this extreme expansion. Right. So one counterfactual that could be interesting is what if there was no population growth, right? There has been this massive expansion in that case as well. I mean, it's
expected to.
Yeah, exactly.
Out,
it's flattening. It's flattening out. But what if it had been flat? Then you could envisage a scenario where the cheaper energy technology would actually have displaced the previous one. But the increased demand has always been such that it's always been better to have more than to replace. That might actually change, but then only when population flattens out, which is around 2050 or so, potentially. But then there are other needs. So this argument doesn't really work until 2100 or so, which is too late for us to fix climate change. But maybe the transition might come then.
And Jean-Baptiste, I wouldn't say that I would call you a tech optimist by reading your book. On the contrary.
On the contrary, I am.
So how do you see?
I think being an historian of technology, I know how technologies have improved radically. I mean, I'm certainly not a technophobic person. I mean, it's not the point. But the thing, it makes me pessimistic about what we can do now, because many of the progress is actually behind us and not in front of us. I can just give you a few examples. When you replace a steam engine with an electric motor in the industry in the 1920s, you divide by 10, at least, actually, the carbon intensity of industrial force. Right? So we have been here before. And now when you replace a gas power plant with solar panels, you divide by 10, 12 the carbon intensity of electricity. So we are not on the threshold of a complete technological revolution simply because we have cheap solar power. I think that's really something, and it's really all the electrotech discourse is based on this premise, which is wrong. Right? I agree with you, there are plenty of technological progress with batteries. There will be probably much better batteries in the next decades. But I mean, we are mainly talking about electricity here. And there is all the rest. And all the rest is much, much more difficult. And I think it's important to recognize that on all these sectors, technology is not so much the issue, I think. Or it's faraway technologies which will come too late for the climate problem. The biggest, one of the most emitting sector is just our bodies. Right? Food, the production of food, from land use change to the management of waste, is 34% of carbon equivalent emissions, right? 34%. I mean, of course, we can improve refrigeration, we can improve many things, we can improve waste management. There can be a lot of progress. I mean, it's not the point.
And we can reduce food waste.
And we can reduce food waste, and we can eat less meat, obviously, less beef in particular, so that to reduce land use changes. But still, I mean, I think the discussion is not so much technological for this 34%. It is mainly about behavior, right? So I think technology is not central for this issue. Then there are the materials, like cement that you mentioned. Steel is very difficult to decarbonize.
There are examples in Sweden.
Yeah, I know,
where
but
they have fossil-free steel production.
So they're going to reduce the iron ore with hydrogen. They are planning on a few million tons of green steel in a few decades. We are producing 1.7 gigatons of steel. So it's not at scale, right? And once again, it's a problem of scale. It's not of course, I mean, you can produce a few tons of clean steel, but it's not the point. I mean, it's just.
But you have to start somewhere, right?
You have to start somewhere. No, I'm not against that, but I'm against the idea that we will be able to decarbonize all the steel industry in 30 years because something is happening in Sweden. This is not the way it works. Right?
If it was in Norway, though,
yeah, sure.
that would have been different, of course.
Okay, so there is still the plastics. I mean, among the at one point on my slide there were many graphs, many curves growing and growing. Most of them are on a linear growth, not an exponential growth, except plastics. Plastic is still on an exponential growth, and plastic is produced from fossil fuels.
Plastic is a huge problem.
Yeah, it's a huge problem
during the entire value chain.
Okay, so and we don't know how to, I think, to decarbonize plastics. We can produce bioplastic, but it's much smaller. The scale will be much smaller. And then you've got aviation, which is more or less impossible. Maritime shipping on big scale is difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it is very difficult. And I'm certainly missing some sectors. In any case, that's why we cannot, for electricity, we could speak of transition. I think it makes perfect sense. But we have been with this technology for a long time, so it's. But for all these sectors, I think we should really talk about demand reduction. And that's what I reproach to economists. They don't want to talk about that. They don't want to talk about degrowth.
So let's talk about degrowth.
I mean, it's not that I think it is the solution, but it should be part of the scientific discussion, and it isn't.
So how would you define degrowth then? Degrowth economically, or let's say reducing consumption? How do you say that? I
mean, for this sector, it's about the reduction of material consumption of plastics, steel, cement, etc., etc. Yeah.
Which is essentially then the circular economy, because some amount of materials is needed. The amount of materials we have is finite. Energy, in principle, is not a problem if you have the growth that we're seeing, which means that we have the energy we need to reprocess materials. So that, in a sense, that's maybe the most techno-optimist path you can go. That we can arrange this, and that can be done in such a way that the economists can still get what they want, in the sense that you can still have economic growth. It's just decoupled from material growth. I think that's kind of the most utopic vision that I've heard. Do you think that is realistic?
I mean, from what I know about recycling, it can work, but only to a certain extent. For plastics, it's rather downcycling, so you can't have the same quality when you mix different plastic resins. I mean,
that's because of today's production, where it's not produced with the view of being recycled.
Some parts are.
Some parts, but not most.
But it doesn't last for many generations, though. That's
and the way we use metals also is problematic. For example, in electronics, they are used in so minute quantities that recycling is more or less impossible or far too expensive. There are all sorts of problems in this idea of like an endless cycle of materials that doesn't work very well. When you look really at the economics of recycling, at what you can really do. I mean.
It often boils down to economy, doesn't it? To the market mechanisms and so on.
But that is maybe the question, and that's so. When I wrote this book recently, I very deliberately, being a physicist, I very deliberately ignored economy for 9 of the 10 chapters. It comes in at the end. I'm very aware that I do not know economy. That's fine. There's a Norwegian economist who has criticized me very heavily for not knowing economy. That's fine. I accept that. I'm a physicist, but I feel that economy is maybe, though important, it is taking a little bit too much of center stage in this discussion, because there are other aspects. I mean, economy will lead us to continued growth in one way or another, unless you can some way. I've yet to meet an economist that really likes the idea of degrowth. Yeah. But that means that sooner or later, and I mean, I say this as someone who's been trying to reduce the doomsday rhetoric around climate. Right? It is serious. It is for the most part not doomsday until you hit a certain point. Mm-hmm. And this kind of accelerated development will actually lead us to that point sooner rather than later. So the question is, luckily this is a smooth transition. So the consequences get stronger and stronger. And the question is, when are they serious enough that we are able to circumvent the current economic regime? Or are we able to bake the consequences, the economic consequences of climate change actually into today's economy so that you put a value on the future, essentially? I mean, it's about discount rates and all these things. It's really, really difficult.
Insurance is probably part of some of the answers, isn't it? Because it's getting more and more costly to insure values and to reassure as well, which is turning into an increasing problem at the moment.
In California, in some areas there, soon you will not be allowed to insure your homes anymore because of fire risk.
So that is one way of actually feeling the consequences of climate change economically and individually. But will it help?
I mean, insurance will put some pressure on economic actors, but it can't drive what is required. I mean, that's only a certain influence, and many people are not insured in the world globally. I mean, insurance is still a rich country institution, so we should not trust too much on insurance companies, I think. I think about economics, I think economics is important, but we need a different kind of economics. What really strikes me is that the value that is only taken care of is still the dollar, the money. But we could imagine economies starting to really reflect not on dollar, but on welfare. And I think it's really a key thing. We should recognize that there will be carbon in the economy after 2050, and even probably later. The big question is, what is the welfare associated with this emission of CO2? And that's really what economists have not been doing, and that should be the center of climate economics. If we take the example of cement, 6-7% of global emissions. Cement is particularly difficult to decarbonize because there is an emission from the process of making cement itself. You can use cement to do like skyscrapers in Oslo. I'm not sure. I mean, it makes a beautiful waterfront, but it's not. I mean, it doesn't create so much welfare. Or you can use it to make, sewage treatment in the poor world or water system that works in the poor world. And there, cement is extremely useful, and it creates a lot of welfare, but probably less dollars, and so it's not put in the right place. And I think that's what economists have not studied properly, because they are dreaming about negative emissions that will become cheap by 2050 with an incredible amount of biomass, which is ridiculous, right? And so for me, economics is not the problem. It is the kind of economics that we have. I mean,
should we get some input from the audience? Because I'm pretty certain that there will be, or that probably there are already some questions. So Paul, he has a microphone, and once you get it, it would be nice if you could state your name, potentially also an affiliation, if you like, and then preferably a question or a comment. So anyone, raise your hand. Yes.
Well, thank you, both of you. I have a rather short question, but it was some talk about the differences between countries and also within countries. And we know that the richest 1% of 0.1%, they emit a very large amount. So how do we get rid of that? James Hansen has for decades argued that we should use tax and dividend, or fee and dividend. I think it was tried in Canada with some success, but I don't think it was followed up. Do you have any comment on his suggestion or any other suggestion to improve the matters?
Go ahead, Bjørn.
I mean, it is being tried. Right. If you can tax carbon in such a way that it gives dividends back, as you say, it's being used in Canada. It seems to be quite successful. But I would have to ask a historian: has any of these system like that ever really changed in such a way that it could take power away from those who have it, or power away from the rich, without an actual violent revolution?
I mean, I don't know. If I understood correctly, the question is about the carbon tax, right?
Yes, yeah, that's essentially what it is.
I think the carbon tax is interesting because it shows what I described in my presentation, the influence of the 1970s and the energy crisis. The carbon tax was kind of not invented, but really put forward in the 1970s. And in a way, when you think about it, it simulates in the economy the effect of an energy crisis. The fact that fossil fuels are getting more and more, little by little, more expensive. So it's exactly what the carbon tax was supposed to do, to make carbon little by little more expensive so that people really innovate, change their behavior, and so on and so forth.
And polluter pays principle.
Yeah,
Yes,
so
as well.
basically the economists explain that this is really the optimal solution, the carbon tax. And I think they're right probably in their economic models. The problem is that it is very unfair, of course, and carbon tax, if it makes cement unavailable in the poor world, it will never work, that's for sure. And I don't know if it is, if I can make this argument, but if we think about Norway and its oil and gas sector, in a way, this is a good example of a carbon tax which works because the money is put for the public goods in a welfare sovereign fund, right? But then, in a way, it makes, it makes an incentive to keep this oil and gas extraction because, of course, it's the benefits are, which is good. It's not to criticize that. It's much better than what happened in Britain, of course. But the benefits are widespread on the whole Norwegian population. So it's, I think it's ambiguous in a way.
Yeah. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but apparently the interest and the revenues from the fund now actually exceeds the value of the oil and gas extraction.
Probably,
on the
because it was well managed.
You
can live on money speculation. I've already admitted that I don't really know economy, right? But carbon tax, right? It has been used internally in Europe. It has been used in China. It's been tested in various markets. What we don't have is a global agreement and system, and that means that there will be a power differential at some point for those who implement it and those who don't. And something we haven't touched on today is the ever-increasing pressure on global cooperation. There is no global cooperation anymore. The US in particular is pulling out of climate negotiations. They will certainly pull out of any kind of a carbon tax or any other kinds of tax. And that seems to be more than just a fluctuation of a few years, right? This is more of a longer-term trend, related also to the increased pressures of climate change, the increased pressure to change the energy sector, but those are only a few of the arguments. So it is not a world where it is easy to get collaboration, and it's not a world where it's easy for power in any form to change hands. It's getting ever more set.
But towards the end of your presentation, Bjørn, you mentioned, or you came with a call to action to your fellow academics. Do you see any role that the academic communities could play in enhancing or at least making collaboration work in other sectors than the political ones?
Sure. Our role is to develop new knowledge, obviously. That's what we love to do. But it is to maintain and disseminate existing knowledge. And that knowledge has always been, or at least since we really started to have an academic system, that has been the basis for developing new technology, new global systems, etc. And I think we're seeing a growth now, we're seeing a change from a world where kind of all... Oh, sorry. I'll be back in a second. Dizzy. Sorry. Just go on. This happens every now and then.
Okay.
I'll be all right in a second.
Yeah. Are there any other questions from the audience that we could take? And then because I would like to finish off later on with, an academic call to action as well. Okay.
Thank you for these inspiring talks. My name is Geir Hestmark. I'm a historian of science and also an ecologist. And I think you're both very much conservative in your estimates about the future. It's very difficult to predict about the future. And as a historian of science, I would like to challenge my colleague that if you look back on the past 150 years on the development of technology and science, isn't it true to say that there have been tremendous progress and tremendous expansion in new insights, revolutionary thing that people could imagine just a few decades and so on? And do you see that this cannot, has this process stopped now, or we have another 100 years? I mean, why wouldn't they look similar to the past 100 years in terms of new scientific invention, progress, and so on? So I'm sort of the rare species of an optimistic ecologist, because I've also read so much history that I think this humanity will rise to the challenge, really, as they have always done in the past.
If I can answer that.
Of course, this was for you.
The classic argument is to say, like, there was a boring French scientist, I forgot his name, who said that airplane will never exist, basically, because it is impossible physically and so on. Sometime in the end of the 19th century. Sorry, I forgot the specifics. Anyway, so of course he was.
Gravity, right?
Yeah, of course he was refuted by the Wright brothers and others, right? But he was refuted because the Wright brother could use oil, right? So I think we should not forget that all these tremendous technological innovations and progress which do exist, they are based on materials, they are based on energy, right? And so I totally agree with you that there might be fantastically new technologies that we cannot even dream about and imagine them. That is perfectly true, given the past experience of history of technology, that's for sure. But it's what the point of the graph I show you, the history of materials is much more boring. We are using more and more of materials and energies, right? It's growing with population. It's also correlated with technological progress. I mean, technological progress improve efficiency, but there is something called the Jevons paradox, which means that we are using more energy because the technology is improving, right? So I think we should not, we cannot infer from past technological development any kind of optimistic future. I think that's really, it's not rigorous.
But isn't another problem we've had that materials have simply been too cheap, right? We have had no particular reason to use less materials, just like we've had no particular reason to use less energy, because it has been available to us. And there are ways of producing the technology of tomorrow with existing materials, right? It does not necessarily have to be a limitation. So, I mean, the physicist in me is actually relatively techno-optimistic, because there are so many solutions that we can have even for today's existing problems. So we can build things in different, more efficient ways. That has been shown.
Oh, yeah.
And again, there are so many people with so much resources now that I think a certain amount of techno-optimism is warranted, so long as you can transition into something like a circular economy or some way of reusing materials. And given enough energy, that is possible. So in a sense, I agree that we shouldn't get too bleak in that particular area. We just shouldn't blindly trust to technology. Right? There has to be a backstop or a different way out.
And does it matter what the reasons that we're doing it for are? I mean, are we doing it for the right reasons? Does that have anything to do with it? Because you're both talking about the sense of urgency. Something needs to change fast.
So an argument I've had thrown at me quite a few times is this usage of the word "we." Right? Who are we? Do we have a common cause? No, we clearly don't. Are we one unified group? Well, no. We're humans on a big sphere, but apart from that, we're quite diverse. So I kind of think we have to accept that things will happen for what we might consider the wrong reasons. Though even in this hall, I'm pretty sure you can have divided opinions on whether getting rich as quick as possible is a good or a bad reason. But if you do that by producing technology that actually benefits people Isn't that fine? You've helped people. You just make an absurd amount of money out of it. It's an interesting discussion you can have. And currently, a lot of technology is driven by, it looks like it's driven by a few individuals, but it's kind of driven by them sitting on top of huge pyramids, right, where they've gathered money, power, industry, and they can change. You can say a lot about Elon Musk, right? But he and his companies have pushed a lot of technological innovation for better or worse, and that's a possibility that really hasn't been there in the past.
Yeah, I mean, given what we just experienced with AI, I would say we have a really non-reflexive relationship with technology. I mean, technological change is driven by giant corporations who are not concerned so much by sustainability. They are concerned about their bottom line. And I mean, basically, because of AI, General Electric right now is saying that I cannot mass produce enough turbines for the gas power plants to power the AI center. So because of AI, emissions in the US have grown, which is quite extraordinary. I mean, normally rich countries see their emissions decrease because technologies become more efficient. They externalize the most polluting production in the poor world and so on. And this is quite extraordinary to see that a country like the US having increasing emissions because of a sudden outburst of a technology which we don't really know what is, what will come out of it. So I'm really pessimistic, given the last few years, about this idea that we can guide technological progress to just favor efficiency and green and technology and sustainability. It's not what is happening at all.
At least not at the moment.
In the area of a call to arms, right? We about doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. We are currently extracting and using so much resources that it is knocking the legs out from under the civilization that we have built. It is not sustainable, but it's hard for us to make a change. But historically, right, we have made changes. We have abolished slavery, at least most places in the world. Women can vote and have jobs and things like that, right? Go 100 years back, we might sit here and joke about the role of women in society. We kind of don't do that anymore. Things have changed.
Well, thank you for that.
Exactly, right? But right, I mean, still have to accept that I'm a white man, approaching 50, in a country where 100 years ago I would have had horrible opinions because that's what I would have been taught, most likely. And I'm glad I don't have those opinions. But when will our opinions change similarly in our relation to nature? If they do, then a lot of the arguments that we've been having here, they kind of fall, right? But it needs some standard bearers. It needs someone to fight that big fight for us to start to do the right thing for the right reason. And I really don't know how we're going to get there.
If I can jump on that point very, very briefly, I was interested as an historian as basically the history of our relationship with nature, if you wish. In a way, we are no better now than any time in the past. People were always concerned about nature in a way. For example, in the 18th century, people were convinced that the world was a creation, right? It was created by God in an optimal way. And still they deforested the earth and they did all these sort of things. In the late 18th century, people were convinced that epidemics was caused by environmental causes, something in the air, not viruses or microbes, but the environment. And nevertheless, they just polluted the environment and the air and so on. So I would not put too much hope in a kind of, environmental enlightenment, because we have been enlightened for quite a while and we haven't changed so much the modes of production. And,
you keep pulling us down.
Yeah, sorry, but this is for me particularly not a viable hope.
Yeah, well, once again, that's why we're here as well. So I've seen at least 2 hands raised. Oh, 3 actually. So go ahead, yeah.
My name is Anders Ilverøy. Just to look for optimistic signals what's happening in the world. If you now had a look on the latest report from AI, we saw that energy produced by solar cell could beat the production of energy by coal in 10 years. This is happening due to the big revolution going in China. So what is the rate for increase of energy produced by solar cell, and what is the rate for coal? Because I see coal seems to get down. It has passed its peak. So please, could you comment on the China
Sure.
the China revolution, and also the rate of change of solar cell versus coal in the global energy use? Thank you.
Okay, very briefly. Basically, of course, the solar is going to explode. It is cheap, it is easy to install. It's like the easiest thing to do. But first, it's mainly about the electric sector. Electric production is 40% of global emission, then there is all the rest, so that's the first point. The second point, in China, you got both an expansion of solar power, but it doesn't mean that they have stopped building power plant from coal power plants. Basically, there's a big expansion of solar power in the western part of China, but the main point of consumption, centers of consumption, are on the east coast. So you need to transmit this electricity to the east coast. So you need to invest in a grid, which is like the expensive thing and complicated thing to do. And to recoup on all the investments, you also put coal power plants next to the solar panel in Inner Mongolia, because there is cheap surface coal that you can exploit. So we should not think as coal and solar as necessarily in opposition. They can work together, right? Of course, they're in competition to a certain extent, but they are also sometimes working together. Right?
But do you see solar taking over for coal?
It is. It is in every forecasting. Like I think I've shown you the picture from the AE, International Energy Agency, and the big line of renewable going like this. It is mainly solar, and coal indeed is decreasing by a third, I think, by 2050. So everybody is seeing that and is commenting on that, but that doesn't solve the climate crisis at all. For one simple reason: CO2 in the atmosphere is cumulative. It is what we add each year. Yeah. So until we get to net zero, there will be global warming, and I don't see it as very optimistic, this graph. It could be worse, basically. You could say that it could be worse. We could reach the 3-degree much earlier, and thanks to solar panels, it will be probably at the end of the 21st century and not in the 2070s.
But still, in that entire line of argument, you're discounting the idea that anything can come in and essentially change the market forces.
No. Once again, solar electricity is cheap. It's going to expand a lot, but then there is the problem of intermittency. So you need some base load, and coal is very practical to do that, especially in China, where you've got a big coal industry. It's not going to vanish in 20 years. This is crazy to imagine that, right?
No.
So so just have a little bit of realism, and you realize that.
But talking. Just to follow up shortly on that and technology, you don't seem to be a big fan of CCS, carbon capture and storage, whereas that could have been, a major contributor to reducing the emissions through burning of coal, gas and oil.
Carbon capture and storage has been subsidized in the US in the 1990s. All the study of what it has created at the level of the power plant are very depressing. They are overcosts, they don't run smoothly, they consume an enormous amount of electricity to the point that every 2 or 3 coal power plants you need a third or a fourth power plant just to power the CCS system. To capture the carbon you need chemicals which are not very nice, and these chemicals they degrade at one point because you have to reheat them to extract the CO2, so you have to dump them somewhere. I've talked about that with actually working really on this topic in the cement industry, and he told me that they end up, it's probably better not to make CCS in the cement industry because they would end up with so much polluting chemicals in the end. It's not a solution at all. But then what is really the scandal, it is the fact that scientists and modelers accepted to put like 10 gigatons of CO2 captured by 2050. There is really a material impossibility of doing that, right? It's really not normal that modelers have accepted this. It's what we are saying about the infeasibility of this.
It is infeasible, but it's an interesting dynamic that led into that, right? So you accepted the inclusion of CCS as a technological option in the integrated assessment models, and in principle, it's cheap if you have the materials. But then it comes back to all these harmful materials actually also being cheap, so you can actually produce them, and then scientists produce a whole vast array of scenarios, some with CCS, some without CCS, but then there are
scenarios without CCS.
Definitely there are many scenarios, but then comes the political agreement that we should avoid dangerous levels of global warming, which has gradually transitioned into the current 2-degree target, which became the 1.5-degree target, which then puts limitations on which scenarios are not acceptable, but are in line with current policy. And it turns out that the only scenarios that are in line with policy in any reasonable way are the ones that have large amounts of carbon capture and storage. Mm-hmm. And hence, that becomes, first carbon capture and storage becomes a de facto necessity, and then negative emissions by the same mechanism. Right?
And we are currently storing CO2 on the Norwegian shelf.
In very small amounts, but yes.
5 tons per year.
Yeah. But this is one area where, I mean, I know we have more questions here, but this is one area where technological innovation is actually, though, still possible, right? Because this is the physical limitation is more how much carbon you can actually put down underground. I think we have academics in the hall who know this better than I think any of us. It's a huge field. So there are actually options.
3 more questions, please. So are you going to the lady or to the gentleman? Oh, so the lady first, and then the gentleman on the back row, and then we have another question.
Yes, so my name is Unni Olsby. I'm a chemist. I work with circular processes, so I'm a technology optimist, that's for sure. But I think that one issue that we haven't really touched upon here is that what drives all of this consumption of energy, it is really that we are all consumers. I mean, here in Norway, we have used per capita our share of the global resources. I think this year it was on the 16th of April.
Overshoot day, yeah.
Overshoot day, yes. And so we need, it is very clear that we are not capable as humans, as individuals, to make the right decisions. We are just consuming more and more. And even if we recycle, even if we have renewable energy, we lose for each cycle, we lose some of that energy. And so we have to build more and more of the energy producing units to store and to recycle. So the question is, or I'd like to have the social scientists or the lawmakers to come up and say, okay, what can we do? Could we impose a tax on using energy? We are net exporters of energy in Norway, so we could make a tax on energy use when you have used more than this amount, and that includes not only the energy you consume directly, but also the goods you import from abroad or whatever. Is there any chance we could have that kind of tax that would benefit the poorer, to let them have what they need, but that some of that extra energy could be taxed heavily?
Yeah. Well, this is carbon tax and dividend, right? I should say, since I'm also on partly.
Not necessarily the carbon tax.
Yeah, but progressive carbon tax, but yes.
Yeah, but a carbon tax will typically impact our what can I say, interaction with other countries. To the global tax on goods, so that will be more complicated.
Individually? Yeah.
I should say we actually tried to have a social scientist on the panel to try and answer exactly these kind of questions, right? Because this is, I think, as well, just where we need to go. But if you ask politicians, they will of course say that's absolutely impossible because we will never get elected
Re-elected.
again, which is a kind of a cop-out answer because if we have a political system and a democracy, that means someone needs to take these uncomfortable decisions. So maybe we can throw that one back and say, I think quite a lot of people in this hall will be convinced that there is a need for either this solution or something similar if we need to work within, or it's either that or it's degrowth. Right? You either work within the economic system and use economic incentives, or you change the economic system.
Maybe we should stop using Norgespris.
Yes, for instance, Norwegian price. That is a fun one.
That's a support.
But I think that actually that is one of the things that I was trying to get at with this call to action for academics, because I think part of our job, those of us who know it, and that would be the social scientists, really need to explain this combination. Because politicians can get re-elected after unpopular decisions if they're well enough explained.
Can I just,
Paul, where are you? Yeah.
Can I just add something about CCS and negative emission? Because it's really something that is dear to my heart. I have a student called Luce Thurenberg who actually interviewed most of the people pushing for the inclusion of CCS and negative emissions in the models. And one of them said, of course we knew it was rubbish. Everybody knows that we cannot store 10 gigatons of liquefied CO2 by 2050. But first of all, it was to push the government to be ambitious. So some of them said that. So it's quite interesting. It's just positive.
It's a political instrument.
It's a political instrument. And another one said, we know that it is the backstop technology. Before it was called non-defined technology in the model. So it just puts some kind of name to the non-defined technology. But that will lead necessarily to the only serious backstop technology that we have, which is geoengineering. So it is what is actually behind their mind. That next time in the model we start using geoengineering to get under the 2 degrees Celsius. So I'm afraid that this blah blah around negative emission is just buying time, and that in the next reports they will be explaining that now we have to do more dangerous thing, which is just changing the albedo of the planet.
So I know we have questions, but I need to get to that one. I mean, I'm part of some of those discussions and have talked to all the people who are implementing these things, and there is a very strong push against implementing geoengineering in the models, simply because we know the answer. Because geoengineering technologies...
It's very cheap.
So exactly. I mean, geoengineering is artificially cooling the planet, right? Injecting sulfur smoke in the atmosphere is essentially, or some other technologies. They would be very cheap. They would, for various reasons, also be very dangerous. One would prefer not to put them in the models. And you also know that if you put them in there, the only scenarios that will be consistent with policy are the ones where we have massive amounts of geoengineering. They will break the models, essentially. You will get no sensible answers out of them because you give them the very cheapest option. So they will not be implemented in the integrated assessment models at this time, or hopefully later, simply because it's
crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy, and it's pointless. I've made exactly the same point, that you cannot have that as the final backstop, and that seems actually to be winning the discussion, at least for now.
The moment.
So let's hope.
Thank you for clarifying
but
that.
But they are the same people. Like David Keith, who is a famous Canadian physicist, was the one who started to push CCS. He's one of the lead author of the 2005 report on CCS, and he's now the most famous figure for the inclusion of geoengineering. So, I mean, I think negative emission is quite similar in terms of ideology and frame of mind, that you can reverse what we have done, can reverse thermodynamics in a way, is quite similar to geoengineering. There is a continuity there, and it's a dangerous path.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you. Interesting debate. I would like you to comment, Torstein Indrebø is my name. I would like you to comment on how the geopolitics may impact energy transition. We see that energy independence is becoming a key issue. That happened in the US. They have changed their foreign policy to some extent. Since they have that, there's no impact from Hormuz close at all. So access to energy in most countries is mainly coal. The big economies, China, India, Indonesia, Asia in particular, but also in Europe. It's also about economic competitiveness. We see that's coming up now in the surface. How do you see that impacting the transition, in particular for the use of coal, since that is more widespread and very important for the big economies? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean that's where I think I was headed, where I almost passed out for tunnel vision a few minutes ago. Sorry about that. We're seeing a regrowth, I think, of smaller collaborations, right? Bilateral agreements, trilateral agreements, coalition of the willing is kind of the latest word in international collaboration, where you bypass this idea that we've had for a while that all these agreements need to have full global collaboration, right? A bottom-up process where everyone agrees. This clearly will not happen for a while. So the question is, when do you get to the stage where a smaller coalition of states that is not the traditional big powers, or maybe a coalition joined by one of the big powers, can actually be strong enough to overpower the interests of another major power, but in such a way that it doesn't trigger World War III? Right. It's not the most serious answer, but the point is, I don't think we know, but there is a growth of an interesting set of constellations that seems to bypass the old powers, where, of course, energy security is their main concern. They talk about climate, they talk about economy, but it's really energy security that's at the bottom.
So new alliances may be formed.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, in front, there is a lot of blah blah about the fact that the energy crisis, because of Hormuz and so on, will be a trigger for the energy transition. I think it's a complete misunderstanding. On the contrary, suddenly expensive oil, difficult oil becomes lucrative because oil is expensive. And for many countries, you're entirely right. I mean, the backstop technology is just digging more coal to replace the natural gas that was coming through before. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think we can have anything good coming out of this geopolitical rivalry. On the contrary, it's a disaster because we need to have a global agreement because many of the good technologies, and I put quotes, come from China. They have a very strong advance in battery technology, solar panel. So this idea that we should restrict trade and have a trade war with China is a disaster for the climate. It's not a good news, or if it's not a disaster, it's not good news. So yeah, I mean, nothing good will come out of it.
We have time for one final question. You've been waiting for a long time.
Okay, thank you for that. So I just want to say that there is a social scientist in the room, and I will play that role. Because I was very interested in, I mean, thanks first for two brilliant lectures, and I have no critical comments as such, but I just wanted to say that there is, in a way, something lacking in the perspectives, in the sense that there is as if there is no politics, neither in this room or in other rooms, so to speak. So, so I was thinking in this discussion about the counterfactual, there could be a very, very different counterfactual history if nature was not regulated, if technology was not regulated. I mean, nature is quite heavily regulated by policy measures. Yeah. Technology is quite heavily regulated by policy measures. So things could have been extremely different than they are today, so to speak. So that is actually the result of very many political decisions. So I just wanted to kind of comment, just to say that is maybe not the elephant in the room, but at least an elephant that is missing, so to speak, in the debate. So and also then I wanted to ask, also, what would be your kind of philosophy of technology? Because in one way, if I were to put it more critically, we could argue that you have in your different ways a philosophy of technology which is about a kind of a deterministic view of technology, that is a thing that we are not so much able to regulate, so to speak. So I was just wanting to throw that question upon you, and also just the most important thing to say that actually nature technology is very politically regulated, and we do have a series of taxes, carbon taxes and everything. So well, that was just the comment.
Thank you. So that's actually a nice rounding up question for you to reply to. What is your philosophy of technology?
So yeah, no, I mean, I think one of the debate in social sciences, which was triggered by the idea of social construction of technology, that society does shape technology in a deep way. I think it is convincing, but only to a certain extent. What I mean by that is the examples, the classic examples like the bicycle, which has been studied by Bishker. Like the bicycle in the late 19th century was a very dangerous, manly thing. It was the great bicycle. And then older consumers wanted different kind of bicycles, so the shape of bicycle changed, and we ended up with the bicycle that we have today, which is actually probably a very important technology in the transition in a way. Anyway, so the bicycle.
Fair enough.
So of course you can have many examples like that. Another example is the electric car. In the 1920s, there were electric cars actually already. But thermodynamics and physics does matter. For example, to have in the 1920s, with the lead batteries that were available at that time, to have the same kind of range that the petroleum engine would offer, you would have needed a battery of more than 1 ton, right? So it would have been an extremely expensive car and very heavy car, right? So I think we can accept the fact that society shapes or direct technologies, but the problem with climate change, it is the fact that, on the contrary, what we experience is that technologies are not so easily transformed. The way we produce steel, for instance, of course it has improved in the late 19th century, but it is more or less the same system, right? We are reducing iron ore with a reductant which is mainly coke, right? And it has been like that for over a century now, and there is no good reason that it will suddenly change, right? So I think we should be careful and accept that technology is not that easily shaped, and that the problem of climate change is precisely all technologies which resist to our endeavor to transform them.
And Bjørn, final words linking climate change and technology, possibly.
There's clearly been regulation, right? And I think we should be very thankful that there has been regulation.
There still is.
And there still is, and there will be more, clearly. We will improve. We are improving. I think a lot of my arguments stem from disillusionment with current policy, right? Because I don't believe there will be strong global policy on regulating climate change or other. I have more belief in kind of these bilateral or coalitions of the willing, at least currently. But the other area is our desire to in any way regulate technology. I really don't think we've seen good examples that at least for technology that is perceived as good for all. I mean, AI is just the newest example of something that we kind of don't need in its current form. It can have some benefits, but it has huge potential negative impacts that we have. We're in no way taking the time, or are we given time to consider them. Any sane society seen from the outside would regulate AI before it got to this level. So how do we get around that? Well, we redefine what a benefit is. Right? What do we want? If we actually want to live in a pact with nature in such a way that our society is sustainable on a millennial scale, can we live in this world for another 1,000 years? If we want that.
As humans, you mean?
As humans, yeah. If we really want that, then what is a good technology also changes. If a good technology isn't just what gives me what I want, immediate entertainment right now, it's also something that gives value to my children, to my children's children, etc. If we can get back that value, because that did exist at some point in history, if we can find some way of getting that back, then that also feeds back on technology, and it helps the climate issue, it helps the resource issue as well. I have no idea how we're going to get there, but you have to believe it's possible, otherwise we're not landing on our feet.
Thank you so much, both Jean-Baptiste Fressoz and Bjørn Samset, and not to forget the beautiful audience who have been asking a lot of thought-provoking questions. So thank you to all of you for being here tonight. So I would like for you to give these two gentlemen a second round of applause. It's been extremely interesting and thought-provoking, so thank you so much for taking the time. We've, spent a couple of minutes over time. Overtime is also a current description for what's going on, so we are in pressing times. I just wanted to point out what happens next at the Academy next week, the 10th of June. The winners of the Kavli Prize 2026 are going to be announced within astrophysics, nanoscience and neuroscience, which are the largest, the smallest, and the most complex ones. So you can read more on the website. And with that, this program is now come to an end. But of course, you can take your time exiting this beautiful building in maybe a couple of minutes or even 20 minutes if you need to. And I guess these two gentlemen will be available for some one-to-one talks as well. So thank you once again, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.